The call came at 2 in the morning on December 23rd, jarring James Mitchell awake from the kind of sleep that never feels deep enough. He fumbled for his phone on the nightstand, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness, his heart already racing with that particular dread that comes with middle-of-the-night calls when you're a single parent. His first thought was Sophie. His second thought was work. His third thought, as he swiped to answer, was, "Please let everyone be okay. Mr. James Mitchell?" The voice was professional, female, unfamiliar. "Yes." "Who is this?" James sat up, running a hand through his hair, glancing at the baby monitor on his dresser that showed Sophie's room. She was still asleep, a small lump under her princess blankets. "This is Sandra calling from St. Catherine's Hospital Administration. I apologize for the late hour, but we have a patient here who has listed you as her emergency contact. She's requesting your presence immediately." James's confusion cut through the fog of interrupted sleep. "What? I work at St. Catherine's, the 1000th and ER nurse. But I don't. Who's the patient?" "Elena Hartwell. She was very specific about your name and contact information. She's in our private care wing and has asked for you multiple times tonight. Mr. Mitchell, I should tell you that her condition is quite serious. If you're able to come, I would recommend doing so soon. Elena Hartwell." James turned the name over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere. He didn't know anyone named Elena Hartwell. He'd never heard that name in his life. He worked in the ER, sure, but he saw hundreds of patients. Could she have been someone he'd treated? Someone he'd forgotten? "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name. Are you sure you have the right James Mitchell?" There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling. "You are James Arthur Mitchell, age 34, residing at 847 Maple Street, employed as an emergency room nurse at this hospital?" "Yes, but then I have the correct person, Mr. Prop Person. Mitchell, I understand this is unusual, but the patient was quite insistent. She's made arrangements for visitors even at this hour. I really do think you should come if you're able." James looked at the monitor again. Sophie was 6 years old, and she'd been sleeping through the night consistently for years now. But he still hated leaving her. Still felt that clutch of anxiety every time he had to work a night shift. Even though Mrs. Chen from next door was reliable and kind, and had raised 4 children of her own. Is the patient in immediate danger?" James asked, his medical training kicking in even through his confusion. Sandra's voice softened. "Mr. Mitchell, I think you should come. That's all I can say." 20 minutes later, James was knocking quietly on Mrs. Chen's door, apologizing profusely for the hour, explaining there was an emergency at the hospital. Mrs. Chen waved away his apologies with the easy grace of a woman who'd seen it all, wrapped her robe tighter against the December cold, and shuffled across to his apartment to settle into his couch with her knitting. Sophie wouldn't even know she was there unless she woke up, which she rarely did. The drive to St. Catherine's Hospital took 12 minutes through empty streets lined with Christmas lights and fresh snow. James had made this drive thousands of times over the past 4 years, ever since he'd moved to this city for the job, but never like this. Never at 2:30 in the morning, driving toward a mystery patient who somehow knew his name, his address, his life, while he knew nothing about her. He parked in the staff lot out of habit, then walked through the emergency entrance where he normally clocked in for his shifts. The hospital had that particular stillness that only exists in the dead hours of night, when most of the world is sleeping and only the sick, the dying, and those who care for them remain awake. Christmas decorations hung in the hallways, wreaths and garland that the day shift had put up earlier in the week, festive and strange against the antiseptic white walls and fluorescent lighting. Sandra met him at the security desk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and tired smile. She handed him a visitor's badge, even though he already wore his staff ID. "She's in the private wing, Mr. Mitchell. 4th floor, room 412. I've let them know you're coming." The private wing. James had worked at St. Catherine's for 4 years and had never set foot in the private wing. That was where the wealthy patients stayed, the ones with premium insurance and private rooms that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent. He'd heard other nurses talk about it, how it was more like a hotel than a hospital, with actual art on the walls and furniture that didn't look like it belonged in a medical facility. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt longer than it should have. James caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. He looked tired, wearing jeans and an old college sweatshirt he'd pulled on in his rush to leave, his hair still messy from sleep. Not exactly the appearance of someone who should be visiting the private wing at 3 in the morning. The hallway on the fourth floor was dimmer than the rest of the hospital, lit with softer lights that felt almost residential. Landscapes hung on the walls instead of the standard motivational posters. Room 41T was at the end of the corridor, and as James approached, a nurse he didn't recognize stepped out, checking a tablet. "James Mitchell?" she asked, quietly. He nodded. "She's awake. She's been waiting for you." The nurse hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "She's been asking for you all evening. We weren't sure you'd come. It means a lot that you did." Before James could explain that he still had no idea who this patient was or why she wanted him, the nurse had moved past him down the hallway, leaving him alone outside the door to room 412. He knocked softly, then pushed the door open. The room looked nothing like a hospital room. A large window took up most of the far wall, showing the city lights and falling snow beyond. Real furniture, a couch, an armchair, a bookshelf with actual books filled the space alongside the medical equipment. Monitors beeped softly in the corner, and an IV stand stood beside the bed. But everything was arranged to look less clinical, more comfortable. And in the bed, propped up on pillows, was a woman who looked at him with such desperate hope that it physically hurt to see. She was young, early 30s, maybe with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and pale skin that spoke of months spent indoors. Beautiful, even in obvious illness, with high cheekbones and large eyes that fixed on his face with an intensity that made him freeze in the doorway. She wore a soft blue nightgown instead of a hospital gown, and her hands gripped the blankets like she might float away without an anchor. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then her expression changed. Hope flickered and died like a candle blown out. Her face crumpled slightly, and tears filled her eyes. "You're not him," she whispered. James stood there, completely lost. "I'm sorry. I'm James Mitchell. The hospital called me. They said you asked for me, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. I don't know you." The woman closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "James Mitchell, the first was so sure. You were the last one on the list. I hoped." She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth, fighting for composure. James should have left. Should have explained to administration that this was clearly an error, that she was looking for someone else, that he needed to get home to his daughter. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way she looked so utterly alone in that big room, surrounded by expensive furniture and equipment, but no people. Maybe it was the Christmas lights visible through the window behind her, reminding him that it was 2 days until Christmas, and this woman was spending it in the hospital bed. Maybe it was just that he was a nurse, trained to respond to suffering, and the look on her face was suffering in its purest form. "How many?" he asked quietly, stepping further into the room. "How many James Mitchells?" She opened her eyes, surprised that he was still there. 17. In this city and the surrounding area, the investigators found 17 men named James Mitchell between the ages of 30 and 40. She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "You were number 17, the last one. God, I really thought you might be him." James moved to the chair beside her bed and sat down slowly. Every instinct told him this was insane, that he should leave, that this wasn't his problem or his responsibility. But he found himself asking, "Who are you looking for?" "My James Mitchell." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The boy I loved when I was 17, the one I haven't seen in 15 years. The one She stopped, swallowing hard. "I'm dying, Mr. Mitchell. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe a month if I'm lucky. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It's everywhere now. They can't do anything except make me comfortable." The clinical part of James's brain registered the information, understanding the severity, the prognosis, what stage 4 pancreatic cancer meant in terms of timeline and suffering. The human part of him felt a deep ache of sympathy. "I'm so sorry," he said, and meant it. "I wanted to find him before it's too late. I wanted to tell him things I should have told him 15 years ago. Things I was too young and too stupid and too scared to say back then." She looked at James with those large, sad eyes. "I hired private investigators. Spent more money than most people see in their lifetimes, tracking down every James Mitchell in the city. Because I remembered he talked about moving here, about going to college here. I thought maybe, after all these years, he'd actually done it." What happened 15 years ago? James found himself asking, drawn into this stranger's story despite himself. "Elena," because he supposed that was her name. Elena Hartwell smiled, but it was the saddest smile James had ever seen. "I was 17. He was 18. It was the summer before his senior year of college, and he was working as a lifeguard at the country club my family belonged to. My father owned half the city's real estate. His father was a mechanic. We were from completely different worlds. But that summer, God, that summer was magic. She told the story like she'd told it 1,000 times in her head but never out loud. About sneaking out to meet him after the country club closed. About lying to her parents about where she was going. About falling in love with a boy who made her laugh, who treated her like she was just a girl instead of Elena Hartwell, heiress to a fortune she'd never asked for. My father found out in August, she continued, her voice getting quieter. He gave James money. A lot of money. Enough to pay for his college education twice over. And he told him to leave. To never contact me again. To understand that he'd never be good enough for our family, and any attempt to stay in my life would only hurt my future. Did he take it? James asked, already knowing the answer. I don't know. He disappeared. I tried calling him, but his number was disconnected. I wrote letters to his old address, but they came back unopened. My father said he took the money and ran, that he'd never really loved me, that I'd been a summer fling for a poor boy who saw an opportunity. Elena's hands twisted in the blankets. I wanted to believe he was lying. I wanted to believe James loved me enough to fight for us, but he never came back, never tried to reach me, and eventually I convinced myself my father was right. If you're feeling this story, if these words are touching something deep inside you, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next will show you that sometimes the people we're searching for are closer than we think, and sometimes the mistakes that bring us together are the universe's way of giving us exactly what we need. So you looked for him, James said softly, after all these years. I'm dying. The words were simple, factual, and I realized I'm going to die with this regret, with not knowing if he actually loved me or if I was just foolish. With not telling him that I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to fight for us. With not telling him that marrying Richard, taking over my father's company, living this life of wealth and privilege, none of it meant anything. None of it made me happy. And every Christmas, every single Christmas for 15 years, I've thought about that summer and wondered what would have happened if I'd been braver. James sat in the quiet that followed, listening to the monitor's beep, watching snow fall past the window. This woman, this dying stranger, had poured her heart out to him, mistaking him for someone else, searching for a love she'd lost 15 years ago. It was the saddest thing he'd ever heard. I should go, he said finally, but he didn't move. You need rest, and I need to get home to my daughter. You have a daughter. Something in Elena's expression softened. Sophie, she's 6. She's everything. Then you should definitely go. But Elena's voice broke slightly. I'm sorry I dragged you here in the middle of the night. I'm sorry for all of this. The investigators were supposed to verify before calling, but I told them to contact everyone immediately. I was so desperate to find him before. She stopped, turning her face away. James should have left then. Should have walked out, driven home, climbed back into bed, and pretended this surreal night had never happened. But instead he heard himself say, "What would you tell him? You're James Mitchell. If he were here right now, what would you say?" Elena turned back to him, surprised. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I'd tell him that I loved him, that I never stopped loving him, not really, that my father was wrong, that he was good enough, better than anyone I ever met in my own world. I'd tell him I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to choose him, that I've regretted it every day, that the life I chose, the money, the status, the security, it all meant nothing without someone to share it with who actually knew me, who saw me as just Elena, not Elena Hartwell, billionaire heiress. She wiped her eyes. And I'd tell him thank you for that summer, for showing me what real love felt like, even if I was too young to appreciate it then. James felt something shift in his chest. This woman was dying. Dying alone in a hospital suite that probably cost more per night than he made in a week, searching for a love she'd lost, trying to make peace with regrets that had haunted her for 15 years. And it was 2 days before Christmas. Tell me something, James said. Do you have anyone? Family who visits? Friends? Elena's laugh was bitter. My father died 5 years ago. My mother visits once a week, stays for exactly 30 minutes, and spends most of that time on her phone. My husband, ex-husband, as of last year, sends flowers with cards signed by his assistant. I have a brother who's already planning how to spend his inheritance. And I have business associates who send well wishes and can't wait for me to die so they can carve up my company. No one else? No one else. She said it simply, like it was just a fact of her life. Turns out, when you spend 15 years building walls to protect yourself from getting hurt again, you end up building a very lonely fortress. James looked at this dying woman, this stranger who'd mistaken him for someone else, and made a decision he didn't fully understand but knew was right. "I'll stay," he said. Elena blinked. "What?" "Until Christmas is over. No one should be alone at Christmas, especially not." He stopped, not wanting to say, "especially not when you're dying," but they both knew what he meant. "I work here anyway. I can visit. Bring you company. It's just a couple of days. You don't have to do that. You don't even know me." "No," James agreed. "But the first know what it's like to be lonely, and I know what it's like to spend holidays missing someone who isn't coming back." He thought of Sophie's mother, of Lisa, dead 2 years now in a car accident that still felt unreal. "So, I'll stay. Just until Christmas passes." Elena stared at him like he'd offered her the world. Maybe, in a way, he had. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for a complete stranger?" James smiled, tired but genuine. "Because it's Christmas, and because sometimes the wrong James Mitchell turns out to be exactly the right person." Outside the window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in white. Inside room 412, a dying billionaire and an exhausted single father sat in companionable silence. Two lonely souls connected by a mistake that was starting to feel less like an error and more like fate. The monitors beeped softly, the night stretched on, and for the first time in months, Elena Hartwell didn't feel quite so alone. James returned to the hospital the next morning, carrying his daughter's hand in one of his and a container of homemade sugar cookies in the other. Christmas Eve. The hallways were decorated even more festively than they'd been in the dead of night, with staff members wearing Santa hats and playing carols softly from speakers mounted in the ceiling. Sophie skipped beside him, her red winter coat making swishing sounds with each step, her blonde pigtails bouncing. "Daddy, is your friend very sick?" Sophie asked as they waited for the elevator. James had thought carefully about what to tell her on the drive over. 6-year-olds understood more than people gave them credit for, but they also processed things differently. Sophie had spent weeks in hospitals when her mother was dying. She knew what monitors meant, what IV lines were for. She'd held Lisa's hand as she slipped away. In some ways, his daughter understood death better than most adults. "Yes, sweetheart, she's very sick, but she's lonely, and I thought we could keep her company for Christmas. Would that be okay with you?" Sophie had nodded solemnly, then insisted on bringing cookies. They'd stayed up past her bedtime, baking them, pressing star and tree shapes into the dough, decorating them with green and red frosting. Now they were slightly lopsided and probably too sweet, but they were made with love, and that seemed more important than perfection. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor. James led Sophie down the quiet corridor, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake bringing his daughter to visit a dying stranger. But Elena had seemed so utterly alone last night, so desperate for human connection, that leaving her by herself on Christmas Eve felt cruel in a way he couldn't justify. He knocked softly on the door to room 412. "Come in," Elena's voice called, stronger than it had been at 3 in the morning. James pushed the door open, and Sophie bounded in ahead of him, stopping short when she saw the woman in the bed. Elena looked better in daylight, or maybe she'd just made an effort. Her hair was brushed, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a different nightgown, pale pink this time, and someone had helped her apply a little makeup. But the pallor was still there, the thinness, the way the illness had carved away at her until she looked fragile as glass. "Hi," Sophie said brightly, apparently deciding that the woman looked friendly enough. "I'm Sophie. Are you Daddy's friend from the hospital?" Elena's eyes had gone wide. She looked from Sophie to James, clearly not having expected this. Yes, I'm Elena. It's very nice to meet you, Sophie. We brought you cookies." Sophie held up the container proudly. "I made them myself." "Well, Daddy helped, but I did all the decorating. Do you like cookies? These ones have extra frosting because frosting is the best part." James watched Elena's face transform. The sadness from last night was still there, buried underneath, but something else rose to the surface. Wonder, maybe, or delight. She smiled, and it reached her eyes for the first time since he'd met her. "I love cookies," Elena said softly. "Especially ones with extra frosting." "That's very thoughtful of you." Sophie climbed onto the chair beside Elena's bed, apparently unbothered by the medical equipment. She'd seen it all before, James realized. In the weeks before Lisa died, Sophie had spent hours in hospital rooms just like this one, coloring and chattering and being the bright spot in otherwise dark days. She knew how to exist in spaces where other children might have been frightened. Daddy said you're sick and lonely for Christmas, so we came to visit. We can't stay all day because Daddy has to work later, but we can stay for a while. Do you like Christmas? I love Christmas. Santa's coming tonight. Did you write him a letter? I wrote him a letter and asked for a bike with streamers and also a puppy, but Daddy says we'll see about the puppy part. Elena laughed, and it was a real laugh, bright and surprised. I didn't write Santa a letter this year. I probably should have. It's not too late, Sophie said earnestly. You can write one right now. I'll help you. What do you want Santa to bring you? The question hung in the air. James saw Elena's smile falter slightly, saw her glance at the monitors, at the IV drip keeping her comfortable. What did a dying woman ask Santa for? But Sophie was waiting expectantly, and Elena seemed to gather herself. I think, she said slowly, I'd ask for good company, for people to talk to, maybe for someone to tell me stories. Do you think Santa brings things like that? Of course he does. Santa brings everything, especially the important stuff. And I can tell you stories right now. You don't even have to wait for Santa. Sophie was already pulling out the crayons and paper James had tucked into her backpack. I'll draw you pictures too. Do you like unicorns? I'm really good at unicorns. And just like that, Sophie had taken over. She spread her art supplies across the rolling table, narrating as she drew stories about unicorns and dragons and princesses who rescued themselves. Elena watched with something close to enchantment, asking questions, admiring each drawing. James settled into the armchair near the window and just observed, feeling something warm settle in his chest. This was good. This was right. By noon, Sophie had covered half the walls with her artwork, taped up with medical tape that a friendly nurse had provided. The sterile hospital suite now looked like a child's bedroom, full of color and life and imagination. Elena had eaten 2 cookies and declared them the best she'd ever tasted, which made Sophie beam with pride. They'd discussed the logistics of Santa's sleigh, debated whether reindeer could really fly, and agreed that Mrs. Claus probably did most of the actual work. I'm going to get us lunch from the cafeteria, James said, standing and stretching. Sophie, you want your usual? Chicken nuggets and apple juice, Sophie called without looking up from her current drawing project. Elena? What sounds good? Elena looked startled, like she wasn't used to being asked what she wanted. Oh, anything is fine. I'm not very hungry. That's what my mom used to say, Sophie said matter-of-factly, still coloring, when she was sick in the hospital. But Daddy always brought her food anyway because you have to eat even when you don't feel like it. That's what he told her. The room went very quiet. James saw Elena's expression shift, understanding dawning. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing perhaps why he'd come back, why he'd brought his daughter, why this felt familiar to him. Your wife? Elena asked softly. 2 years ago. Car accident. She was sick for 3 weeks before she died. James kept his voice steady, factual. He'd learned to talk about it without breaking down, mostly for Sophie's sake. So yeah, I know what hospital Christmases look like. I know what it feels like to be the person in the bed and the person in the chair. I'm sorry, Elena whispered. Me too. James managed a small smile. But that's why I get it. Why I came back. No one should spend Christmas alone in a hospital if they don't have to. So, lunch. I'm thinking soup and sandwich? He left before Elena could respond, knowing she was crying and wanting to give her privacy for it. The cafeteria was busier than usual, full of visitors and staff members grabbing meals between shifts. James loaded up a tray with fried chicken nuggets for Sophie, soup and a turkey sandwich for Elena, a burger for himself, and headed back upstairs. When he returned to room 412, Sophie was sitting on the edge of Elena's bed, and Elena had her arm around the little girl's shoulders. They were looking at something on Elena's phone photos, James realized as he got closer. Old photos. That's him, Elena was saying, her voice thick with emotion. That's my James Mitchell. The one I've been looking for. James set down the tray and moved closer. The photo showed a teenage Elena, vibrant and laughing, her arm around a young man with shaggy brown hair and a lifeguard's tan. They were on a dock somewhere, sunset behind them, looking at each other like they were the only 2 people in the world. He looks nice, Sophie said seriously. Did you love him very much? I did. I do. Elena wiped her eyes. I made a very big mistake, a long time ago, Sophie. I let him go when I should have fought to keep him. and now I can't find him to tell him I'm sorry." "Maybe he knows anyway," Sophie said with a child's simple wisdom. "Maybe he remembers you too, and knows you didn't mean it." Elena pulled Sophie closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Maybe you're right." They ate lunch together, the three of them, making it feel less like a hospital meal and more like a strange little Christmas Eve picnic. Elena ate more than James expected, probably because Sophie kept insisting, and Elena didn't seem capable of disappointing the little girl. They told stories, shared memories, laughed at Sophie's knock-knock jokes that didn't quite make sense. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sophie started to get sleepy, curling up in the armchair with her coat as a blanket. James stood to leave. He had a shift starting at 6, would need to drop Sophie at Mrs. Chen's. But Elena reached out and caught his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today, for bringing her. I don't know when I last felt this happy." James squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to spend Christmas alone, Elena. We'll come back tomorrow, Christmas morning. Sophie will want to tell you what Santa brought her. You've already done too much. You don't owe me anything." "I know, but I want to. We want to." James glanced at his sleeping daughter. Sophie lost her mother. She understands loss in a way most kids her age don't. But she also understands that sometimes people need you, even if they're strangers. Especially if they're strangers, maybe. Elena's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't understand why you're being so kind to me. Because someone was kind to me when Lisa was dying. Because a nurse sat with me in the waiting room at 2 in the morning and let me talk about my wife for 3 hours straight. Because another single parent brought us casseroles for a month after the funeral. Because people showed up when they didn't have to, and it made the difference between surviving and drowning." James smiled sadly. "So now I show up. That's how it works." There was a long pause. Then Elena said, her voice barely audible, "James, there's something I need to tell you. Something I need to ask you. And you're going to think I'm crazy, but please just hear me out." "Okay." Elena took a shaky breath. "My will leaves everything to charities and family members who don't actually care if I live or die. Cousins who haven't called in years. Business partners who want my company. Lawyers and accountants who send sympathy cards with their bills attached." She looked at Sophie, sleeping peacefully. "But that little girl came here on Christmas Eve and drew me pictures and told me stories and made me laugh. And you came because I was alone. Not because you want something from me. Not because you're obligated. Just because it was the right thing to do." "Elena, I want to change my will. I want to leave my estate to Sophie. A trust fund. Enough to pay for her education, to give her opportunities, to make sure she never has to worry about money the way some people do." Elena's grip on his hand tightened. "I know it sounds insane. I know you'll probably say no, but please, James. Let me do this one meaningful thing before I die. Let me know that my money will actually help someone who deserves it." James felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Estate, trust fund. He'd looked up Elena Hartwell on his phone during his lunch break, curious about the woman he'd agreed to spend Christmas with. The articles described her as a billionaire heiress, owner of one of the largest real estate companies in the state. Her estate would be worth millions, maybe hundreds of millions. "I can't accept that," he said immediately. "Elena, we barely know you. We came because you were alone, not because we wanted anything from you." "I know. That's exactly why I want to give it to you." Elena's voice was urgent now, passionate. "Don't you see? Everyone in my life wants something. My mother wants me to hurry up and die so she can stop pretending to care. My brother wants his inheritance. My ex-husband wants the divorce settlement finalized before I die so he gets more. But you and Sophie, you came for nothing. You brought cookies and drawings and company. You gave me the best Christmas Eve I've had in 15 years, and you asked for nothing in return." "We don't need your money," James said, but his voice was gentle. "We're okay. I work hard, but we have enough. Sophie is happy. We're building a good life. But imagine what you could give her with more. College paid for without loans. Travel, experiences. A house of her own someday. Security." Elena looked at him with desperate eyes. "I'm going to die, James. Probably in the next few weeks. And I'm going to leave behind more money than any one person should have. And it's going to go to people who don't need it and won't appreciate it, and will probably fight over it like vultures. Please, please let me give it to someone who will use it to build something beautiful. Let me know my life meant something." James looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the conversation happening above her. He thought about the student loans he was still paying off from nursing school, the overtime shifts he worked to afford Sophie's after-school program, the fact that he'd had to choose between fixing the car and buying her the bike she wanted for Christmas, and the car had won because it had to. The way he lay awake sometimes worrying about her future, about college tuition, about giving her the life she deserved. But he also thought about why he'd come here in the first place, about showing up for someone who was alone, about doing the right thing without expecting anything in return. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "That's all I can promise right now. Let me think about it." Elena nodded, wiping her eyes. "That's more than I had any right to ask for. Thank you for even considering it." James woke Sophie gently, bundled her into her coat, promised Elena they'd be back in the morning. As they left, he turned back from the doorway and saw her surrounded by Sophie's drawings, looking less like a dying billionaire and more like a woman who'd just been given an unexpected gift. The gift of not being alone. The gift of mattering to someone, even if just for a day. The gift of hope that maybe, just maybe, her life would mean something after all. He worked his shift in a daze, going through the motions of triage and patient care, while his mind spun with impossible questions. By the time he got home after midnight, technically Christmas morning, Sophie was already asleep at Mrs. Chen's. He carried her home, tucked her into bed, and stood in her doorway watching her sleep. What would he do with millions of dollars? What would it mean for Sophie's life? Was it wrong to accept such a gift from a dying stranger? Was it wrong not to, if it meant everything to Elena? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing: tomorrow was Christmas, and he promised to show up. So he would. And maybe the rest would figure itself out. Outside, snow was falling again, covering the world in fresh white. Inside, a single father stood vigil over his sleeping daughter, and wondered if sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in the strangest packages. Sometimes miracles looked like mistakes, sometimes angels looked like strangers, and sometimes the family you found was worth more than any fortune, but the fortune meant you could keep them safe forever. Christmas morning was a few hours away. James set his alarm and tried to sleep, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, nothing would ever be quite the same again.